Hi, this is Zinky35, and today I wanted to speak about some of the movements that were going on in Gnosticism. Specifically, at this time in this video, I want to discuss the movement of Marcion, the Marcionites, and also talk about the Apostolic Fathers during the 1st century AD. And I'm just gonna redo what I wrote on this essay, and then I will get into other things. So what I'm going to do in this series is I'm going to give you some historical references. You can take notes to be able to look up certain sects and people, because I'm going to mention the dates and everything. And then after I do this, I will start getting into more of the different sects that there were in Gnosticism, including some of the things that were found later with the Nag Hammadi. Right now, I'm going to call this the Gnostic sects and the struggle of the church in the 1st century. This went on for quite a while, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start with the regarding of Scripture and their main approaches, and the acceptors, the people that accepted the Old Testament, like Simon Magus, Cerinthus, Valentinus, and Basilides. These people have different Gnostic works, although they aren't the Christian view of how things are, even though they're Christian Gnostics. And then the rejectors of the Old Testament, which is Marcion of Sinope. And so I'm going to go ahead and start with Marcion. Marcion of Sinope and other Gnostics, one of the greatest threats to Christianity. He saw no link between Judaism and the Gospels, and he was the son of a bishop born in circa 85 through 160 AD. He was a rich merchant who owned ships and traveled around the world to Rome around 135 AD. This is where his presence became known, and he started to teach in these areas. So due to what he contrasted within the religion of Judaism, he told those in his stewardship to reject the God of the Old Testament. And he portrayed the God of the Old Testament as the evil craftsman, or the Demiurge, and the creator of the evil world because of Marcion's ideology. He was actually considered to be a heretic for even saying this stuff. So he had rejected the entire premise of the Old Testament as the God of the Christ, and started gathering and establishing an unorthodox canon. So in his canon, he placed his favorites, which was the Pauline epistles, and these books included Galatians, Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Roman, 1st Thessalonians and 2nd Thessalonians, Ephesians, called the Laodiceans by Marcion. He didn't include 1 Timothy, Colossians, Philippians, or Philemon, 2 Timothy, Titus, and the Epistle to the Hebrews. All of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were rejected by him, except for a mutilated Gospel of Luke, which was missing parts to the church's version of the Gospel. So he used a mutilated part which had to do with Luke 5. And this was because Jesus is saying that you don't put new wine into old wineskins, and a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, just as a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. So he used this in reference to why Jesus, or the Christ, would have nothing to do with the God of the Old Testament. So this became a heresy. he was a heresiologist. And so he excluded writings of Paul referring to the Old Testament within a good light, or anything that referenced hell or judgment. So the movement of Marcion, led by the church, began naming the acceptable documents, the canonization of the New Testament, and eventually Marcion's movement and heresies caused him to become excommunicated in 144 AD. You can find Justin Martyr speaking of him in the time of 150 AD and his heretical Marcionite gatherings in the late 2nd century AD. So although the fathers excommunicated Marcion, he continued to spread his teachings throughout the Roman world. And within the Marcionite creed, marriage and the eating of meat was rejected to instill the hermetical lifestyle within their cultural society, which was the Arcanum. The Marcionite movement stood strong until the 4th century. As with all sects that held to certain and sometimes similar beliefs, there were other cults that were known, the Ophites, who worshiped the serpent of the Old Testament as the great grantor of knowledge, and the Cainites, whom worshipped Cain, as well as Esau, Korah, and also the Sodomites. And then you have the Carpocratians, a liberty sect that only followed the gospel according to the Hebrews, and the Borborites, a liberty gnostic sect that descended from the Nicolaitans. So before I go on, I want to bring in some other histories of peoples that were in this time, which I will also be discussing further in the future videos. So I'm gonna throw in some names here, because these are the people that were around during this time. There was Irenaeus, he was a bishop. Papias was Aristion, the elder, and is one who wrote the ending of the Gospel of Mark, starting from verse 8. We have Eusebius, and he writes about Papias, and who wrote the Gospels of Matthew, Mark. Eusebius preserved the verbatim words of Papias. And Papias states that Matthew wrote the Hebrew oracles, and they were interpreted as one was able. Now, I'll be getting into all of this stuff. These are just notes. There's a tale called the Shepherd of Hermes, and this is an apologetic document that was written in Rome in the Greek language, and this was before the middle of the 2nd century. So the author is Hermes, and he is the brother of a bishop by the name of Pius I in circa 140 and through 154 AD. He believed to be freed slaves. Hermes receives a book from the angelic being, that this being was representative of the church, and this angel had given him a book. This is a vision that the angel had taken back the book to continue writing instructions. So in this vision, Clement of Rome is mentioned. So this is where you're going to start seeing where these people are and that they're talking about each other. So this is the only reason why I'm mentioning this, is because these people were mentioning these other people. This is how you link the histories together to see what era that it was actually written in, and to fact check it with other histories, and how we know that these people actually were there. This type of thinking caused the movement of faith against the presbyters, which is believed to be Marcion, the Gnostic, in 85 through 160 AD. And like I stated before, he came to Rome approximately at 140 AD, and Marcion's father was a bishop, and he desired to be admitted into the priesthood to even possibly become the Bishop of Rome. Now, he fully believed that Christ was the Spirit. There were many things that he didn't believe with what the church fathers, especially the Gospels. He didn't want any mention of anything with the Old Testament. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because this is where the ideology of the God of the Hebrews becomes the devil. And so this is why I mentioned in my Saturn L video that there are so many things that have been twisted through time for the understanding. And it's from the Marcionites that rejected the deity of the Hebrews because of what I stated earlier with his thoughts of the wineskin new wineskins cannot hold old wine. You don't put new wine into old wineskins, okay? So this is the problem that you're seeing on YouTube, where people are going around saying that Saturn L is the god of the Hebrews. And we start getting into this god is supposed to be evil and wicked because of what Marcion said. And this is what you see today. This is what you're seeing, this movement that is stating that the Jews' God is evil. So this kind of ideology that I'm speaking about here, which I'll get into even further, but I just want to explain why I'm doing this. It came from ancient tales, except later on, the Mesopotamian religion had died off because when the Greek Empire ended up taking over the Persian Empire that ruled over Babylon, they ended up taking over. They had placed their gods into place. A lot of these things ended up coming through into the new, it was a new age from the former gods that were known for thousands of years. And even the Jews themselves, when they came out of exile, ended up writing about these gods and took the ancient tales of the creation epics and all this stuff that I've been explaining in my videos, but this wasn't written until later. And so when people are reading the New Testament as well, they're getting tales from the ancient Mesopotamians, and also they aren't really reading what was written by Moses. What they're getting is what was written by Ezra. Ezra is the one who wrote the Torah. I have gone into a lot of information about before their captivity. And this is really important to understanding what is going on here, because all this stuff that I'm talking about happened before this era, happened before he was called the Demiurge, happened before archons came into existence, happened before aeons, and all this other stuff was written about. Enoch and Hermes and all this other stuff came after the fact. And these are philosophies that were going around during this time, and that's what I'm going to be getting into. But really, what's important about this is how the people on YouTube right now are going around that saying Saturn L is the God of the Old Testament. He's the God of the Jews. I have put out some videos on Jeremiah, and this is an 8th century document. It was written about Nebuchadnezzar before he had taken over the kingdom of Judah, before he took over Jerusalem. And it states that God, in Jeremiah, because of their disobedience, because of them setting up shrines to the gods over the land of Canaan and the Samaritan gods, and they were following after the customs of the Israelites, when the Israelites, the 10 northern tribes is what I'm meaning, 10 northern tribes were worshiping Baal and the Asherahs and sacrificing their children in the fires, and they started falling into the same type of thing because the surrounding area was filled with these pagan idolatries. And so this is why it states in Jeremiah that God wanted them to get out of there, because he did not want them to be following after these same types of religions in the cults of El. And I have spoken about this, about the cults of El, which is the Samaritan and Canaanite regions, and they were worshiping the bull god, and they were worshiping El. There's a Yahweh there, but there's this God telling them to leave. Now, this God that's telling them to leave is in favor of Nebuchadnezzar, because he specifically in Jeremiah, it states, called Nebuchadnezzar his servant. And I know that people say, well, in Jeremiah 52 it says this. Well, what people don't understand is that there has been redactions that have been made in these books. And that's why in the book of Jeremiah you see it going back and forth, back and forth. But in any event, within the contextual evidence of what it's stating, whether you believe he existed or God exists, it doesn't matter. I'm talking about the context of what the story actually states. So, because of this, God punishes them, and he has his servant Nebuchadnezzar to take them out from the land of El, because he wanted them to prosper. And he wanted the children to grow up in a different land, because he did not want them to follow the ways of their fathers and their brothers and their forefathers, of them worshiping and sacrificing their children, because it was an abomination to this specific God. And then people will say, no, because God wanted that. God, and this is like the idea of Marcion and all this stuff. But even though it talks about that they did this, no one seems to be recognizing within the Saturn L movement that within these texts, it states specifically that God of the Hebrews said to not do those things, and that it never came to his mind for them to do those evil, wicked things, sacrificing your children and worshiping these other gods. Well, who are these other gods? I've been saying this a lot. These other gods are the ancient Mesopotamian Anunnaki gods. These gods are from old, the Ancient of Days. They are the Ancient of Days. There are several of them. And this is why I have been explaining this to you. So some people believe that Enlil is the god of the Hebrews, that he's the savior one. And then when I make videos about like Satan, the greatest deception, people, because of the misunderstanding, they don't understand a lot about the ancient history. And when I'm talking about like El, and I'm talking about Satan and stuff like this, I'm trying to show, well, I'm not trying, I am showing where they get this Prince of the Air idea later on, and how things are twisted. Who would be the serpent of the good tree? Who would be the serpent in the garden? Who would be the one who was in the garden from the beginning? Who is Adam? And all this other stuff. This is why I do all this stuff, because ancient history, the most ancient history, tells us a completely different story, although different cultures down the line ended up taking and incorporating it into their own, but with their own fix upon how they want their culture to be stemmed off of, different from the previous culture. So most of the things that I've been showing in the My Anunnaki Gods series, which has to do with the comparisons of this god called Marduk with the comparisons of the God of the Bible with Yahweh, which is actually the Tetragrammaton, which is a translation of the Greeks. This is not the original name. You will not see the Jews using the original name. And they they are rabbinical Jews, okay? This is Judaism. And they believe their oral tradition, or have stated that their oral tradition comes from Moses, although Ezra, after the Babylonian exile and the Jews had gone back into Jerusalem, and he writes about this, but he wasn't there during that time that all this was happening, when Darius had funded and done what his father had stated to do. And you can find things in the Behistun inscriptions that are found in Iran, and it's a big writing that is upon the walls of a mountain. And these are inscriptions that were written about Darius's reign. He ended up helping to fund the Temple of Jerusalem because Cyrus had this great ruler, Cyrus. He was a humanitarian ruler, and that's why he was called the King of Kings. He was very empathetic towards people, and he helped people. And so he followed his rules because he found his seal that stated his proclamation of what he wanted to do with the people of the surrounding nations and to help them. I want people to understand that there is so much to discuss, especially when it comes to the empires and the gods and Gnosticism, and the way that these things have actually been written, to see that these later constructs, these later things are different ideologies, different philosophies that came about later, and this is where you start getting the evil god. And it started going through all the way into the 4th century, like I said, and even later on in time. I mean, you get a lot of things being stated. People will start reading Carl Jung, but I want to go through all the Gnostic sects, and I also want to let you guys know about the church fathers, the first church fathers and the empires, and how a lot of this stuff was written, and the different Gnostic sects, because not all the sects are the same. Not all of them think alike. It's far from what the Old Testament would contain, which Judaism is completely different, like I've been saying, from the religion of Christianity. And even the Orthodox Christians know this. There were Judaist Christianity back then, but they broke off from that. And these are things that I'm going to get into. I'll also get into the empires of the Roman Empire, because you have to see everything. So I just wanted to give you an introduction into what I'm going to be discussing and how I'm going to take it back to the ancient times, because there's a lot of Oriental philosophy in this, and there's also a lot of Zoroastrian philosophies and creeds that are within this, with the dualistic natures of how they're trying to do things in this area. I'm also going to use the Gnostic Christians. They truly believe that in Christ, but it was in a different way from Christ being incarnate. They didn't believe that Christ was a human that died upon the cross. They believed him to be a spirit or a phantom, and I'll get into all this later. I want you guys to understand that when I'm doing all this comparisons, that I'm trying to show you how it links to certain areas, is certain ideologies, and where it stems from. So now we know, with the thoughts of Marcion and how it spread through time, these are called Marcionites. So the people that believe that the God of the, even in this day, are Marcionites. They're going off of Gnosticism, of this type of Gnosticism, because this is the Gnosticism that actually rejected the Old Testament and the God of the Old Testament, and he becomes the evil demon. He becomes the evil one. And then, of course, like I said, you have the Ophites who actually worship the serpent, and there are some of those hanging around as well. So that's what I'm going to be getting into. I didn't finish up on Marcion, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring in the presbyters, which is Marcion of Sinope, believed to be him. I was stating that Marcion's father was a bishop, and he wanted to actually be admitted into the priesthood and become a bishop of Rome. But of course, because of his upside down philosophy of what the church was actually writing, he was excommunicated. It'll go into Marcus Aurelius. It goes into Eusebius, Quadratus, Publius, Simon Bar Kokhba. It's a very, very deep and interesting history. Anyway, I will be talking to you soon. I just wanted to put this out so you guys know that I am writing an essay on this. I do have an essay, but I want to try to make the videos really nice, put the pictures in there real good, and try working on my editing, because I really haven't been doing a lot of editing lately because of some events. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoy this, and I will be talking to you all soon. And I'm wishing you a great day. This is Zinky35.